All right, let's dive deep into the fascinating world of pulmonary mechanics. We're going to explore the fundamental physics, the laws of pressure, volume, and flow that literally make breathing possible. This is the bedrock science that explains everything from a simple breath to how a mechanical ventilator keeps a patient alive.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start with the single most important physical law in all of this. Then, we'll figure out which pressures actually inflate the lungs. From there, we'll get into concepts like compliance and recoil, see how they go haywire in different diseases, and finally, we'll look at how the whole system finds its perfect balance.
Okay, first things first. Before we can understand anything else, we have to establish the one physical law that governs absolutely everything about how air moves in and out of our lungs.
So what exactly do we mean by pulmonary mechanics? Well, it's really just applying basic physics to how we breathe, that interplay of pressure, volume, and flow. And we're mostly going to focus on inspiration, breathing in. That's the active part that requires muscle work. Breathing out, at least when you're resting, is usually passive. It just happens because of stored energy, but we'll get back to that later.
And it all comes down to this one simple, elegant rule, Boyle's law. It just says that as you increase the volume of a container, the pressure inside it goes down. So, when your diaphragm contracts, it increases the volume of your chest. That makes the pressure inside your lungs drop just below the pressure of the air around you, and poof, air rushes in. It's that simple.
Now, that brings up a really crucial question. When we talk about Boyle's law and pressure, which pressure are we actually talking about? It's not as simple as just the air pressure around us. There's a very specific pressure gradient across the lung tissue itself that does all the work. To really get this, we have to be precise. The body is incredibly smart. It uses a whole system of different pressures, and figuring out the one specific pressure difference that's responsible for actually stretching open the lung tissue, well, that's the key to understanding everything else.
And the answer is transpulmonary pressure, or TPP. Think of this as the net inflating pressure. It's the force that's literally pulling the lungs open. As the formula shows, it's the difference between the pressure inside the tiny air sacs, the alveoli, and the pressure just outside the lung, in what's called the pleural space. It's this exact pressure difference that has to fight against the lung's natural desire to collapse.
So let's break that down. The first part is intraalveolar pressure. That's just the pressure inside the alveoli themselves. We usually measure it relative to the air around us, which we just call zero. So to get air to flow in, it has to dip slightly negative, and to push air out, it becomes slightly positive. Simple enough.
The second part is intrapleural pressure. This is the pressure in that little potential space between the lung and the chest wall. And here's the cool part. It's always negative. Why? Because you have a constant tug of war. The lungs are always trying to shrink inward, while the chest wall is trying to spring outward. That tension creates a suction, a negative pressure that gets even more negative when we breathe in. Okay, let's put it all together and look at the numbers here. Check out that TPP column. See how even at rest, there's a positive pressure of +3? That's what's keeping your lungs from collapsing completely. Then, as you breathe in, the intrapleural pressure drops way down, which makes the TPP shoot up to +8. That's the extra force that pulls the lungs open to take in a breath. All right, so now that we've nailed down the driving pressure, that transpulmonary pressure, we can start to connect it to the result, the actual change in lung volume. How much air do we move for a given amount of pressure? This relationship is what we call static compliance. It's really just a measure of the lung's stretchiness, or its distensibility. The formula is just change in volume divided by change in pressure. It tells you exactly how much your lungs inflate for every little bit of transpulmonary pressure you apply. And we call it static because we measure it when there's no air moving. But here's the catch. This relationship isn't a straight line. At really low lung volumes, it's kind of tough to get things started. You have to pop open collapsed alveoli. And at really high volumes, the tissues are already stretched to their limit and get stiff. The sweet spot, where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of volume for pressure, is right there in the middle, which is exactly where we do our normal, everyday breathing. Now, that model is a pretty good starting point, but the reality in a living, breathing lung is, a bit messier. The lung isn't just a passive balloon, it has its own internal forces that actively fight against being inflated. So, is it really that simple? Well, when we do really precise measurements throughout a full breath, we find something fascinating. The path the lung takes when it inflates is not the same path it takes when it deflates. That little detail tells us there are other forces we need to account for. This gap between the two curves is a phenomenon called hysteresis. You can see it right here. It takes more pressure to inflate the lung to a certain volume than the pressure the lung exerts when it's deflating past that same volume. So where does that extra energy go? It's spent overcoming two things: the natural elasticity of a lung tissue and, crucially, the surface tension of the thin layer of fluid inside every single alveolus.
A huge part of this opposition comes from elastic recoil pressure. Think of it as the lung's natural springiness. The tissue is full of elastin and collagen fibers that make it want to snap back to a smaller size. Your transpulmonary pressure has to constantly fight against this recoil pressure just to keep the lung inflated at all.
So, why do we care about all these details? Because once you understand this tug-of-war between inflating pressure and elastic recoil, you can build a really powerful model to understand what goes wrong in lung diseases.
This table lays it all out beautifully. Look at the two big extremes. On one side, you have an obstructive disease, like emphysema, where the elastic fibers are destroyed. This leads to very low recoil and super high compliance. The lungs are like floppy paper bags. On the other side, you have restrictive diseases like fibrosis, where the lung becomes stiff and scarred, giving it high recoil and very low compliance.
And you could actually see these changes on the pressure-volume curve. With emphysema, the curve shifts up and to the left. That tells you it takes very little pressure to get a huge change in volume. But with fibrosis, it's the total opposite. The curve shifts down and to the right, showing that you need a massive amount of pressure to get even a tiny bit of air in. That's the classic sign of a stiff, non-compliant lung.
Okay, for our last piece of the puzzle, let's zoom out. The lungs don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're inside the chest cavity. So to really understand the system's natural resting state, we have to look at the lung and the chest wall as one single unit.
And it all comes back to that tug-of-war we talked about. You have these two opposing forces constantly at play. The lungs, with their elastic recoil, are always trying to pull inward, but the chest wall has its own natural springiness, and it wants to expand outward.
And the exact point where those two forces perfectly balance each other out, that's the system's equilibrium point. The volume of air in your lungs at that moment, right at the end of a normal, quiet exhale, is called the functional residual capacity, or FRC. It's the point where the total recoil of the whole system is exactly zero.
And this brings us right to the heart of the clinical challenge. When you have a patient whose lungs are either way too floppy or way too stiff, how do you use a ventilator to support them? How do you give them the breath they need without causing more damage? A deep understanding of these mechanics is absolutely essential for designing ventilation strategies that actually protect the lung and improve a patient's chances.